Thank you all again for being here and for staying. I have a wonderful pleasure of welcoming a very expert panel this evening. Please help me welcome Brittany Spiker, Teneille Brown, JD, and Leslie Francis, JD. Thank you all for being here. So there's a lot to unpack here. This is the second time I've seen it. I just said to Teneille as we walked in, it was hard to not have your jaw hit the floor about every 20 minutes. And I'm not an expert on this panel. I'm a young woman, a consumer in many ways, and it certainly shocked me to watch this movie, and I'm sure for yourselves as well. So, you know, I want to open it up really to the panel to kind of get your connection to the film, which, you know, the title itself, the bleeding edge technology that is so cutting edge that it's dangerous to us. And we, you know, even in this last scene, it's just heartbreaking to watch, you know, men and women, adults and from any age and families. It's dangerous to us. So I would love to just kick it off with get a little bit of a sense of who you are and your connection to the film. And then I have a very broad question, and then I want to open it up to the audience. So Brittany, if we could start with you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I am a consumer of eSure, you know, yay, you can go back to work the next day. And here I am 5 years later with many medical issues, and I'm actually less than 2 weeks post-op, a total hysterectomy at the age of 37 and bilateral salpingectomy, which is removal of your tubes. And honestly, I feel better in the last 2 weeks being post-op than I have for the 5 years prior.
So I'm Teneille Brown. I'm a professor at the law school at the university. I teach torts, so I think about this from like the safety perspective of suing the manufacturers. There's a whole lot there if you're interested in that stuff and how hard it is to do.
Very much so.
Very hard, and especially in the last 10 years, it's been a lot harder. And I also am in the program for medical ethics and humanities, so I think a lot about patient access and safety and conflicts of interest and things like that.
I'm Leslie Francis. I'm a law professor and a philosophy professor at the U. I'm also part of the program in medical ethics and humanities, and at the law school we have a Center for Law and Biomedical Science where we're, Teneille's part of that too, where we're interested in trying to figure out how to improve the law and how to use what law clearly inadequate we've got. So I do have a few suggestions about some more things that might even be done without statutory and regulatory change. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Well, I guess before my big question, I would rather actually hear from you all in just a greater connection to the film, you know, from seeing it once or twice, for each of you in your respective fields and expertise and experience. Where's, you know, there are many problems, obviously. Like I said, there's a lot to unpack, but medical devices, where did we go wrong and how do we go forward? Yeah, whoever would like to start.
You could
I have so much to say. So as much as this, we had a really negative reaction to watching this and thinking, how could this be? How is this possible? How does the FDA not have more of a handle on this? It's actually worse than what it's presented in the film, because at the end they hinted at that these manufacturers aren't being held liable, and the reason for that is there's preemption. There's something that says if it's cleared through, if it's cleared through the FDA, you can't bring those state tort claims like product defect claims. The 510 is different, you may be able to still there, but the money, there's just so, it's a market failure, obviously. There's a major asymmetry between what the consumers know about the health risks, what the manufacturers know, and even what the doctors know. And all of the incentives are pushing in the direction to do more, be innovative. Consumers even think newer is better. So the Da Vinci, for example, the university has 2 Da Vinci machines. They're collecting dust, but they were purchased in part because that's what people wanted. And you see the psychological side of this too with physicians. These are kind of, I mean, they're not unethical, but these are sort of toys and fun for them, but they're very expensive. So I think it's a very big problem because there's so much that's going into this. It's not always nefarious, but there are a lot of incentives nudging in the direction of if it's all about self-regulation, and if we're putting it on the industry to collect this data, as was mentioned, they obviously have no incentive to do that. And when you have a market failure like this, I think this is a test case for why regulation is not bad. And the whole idea of just anti-regulation in this sort of sphere is really dangerous.
So potentially there's too many powers that be, and how do we mitigate those? And everyone has a larger say than we do, and we want to be able to trust our care providers.
Right.
So, I mean, we're obviously speaking to the choir in a lot of ways, and the three of us are part of the choir too. So I'll try to just raise one question and then a suggestion. We don't want to make things so hard to get there are some important new devices that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. And unfortunately, industry can take advantage of too much regulation too. That's why you get things like, for every new regulation, let's throw out two without thinking about what regulations do. One of the ways to try to balance, and this is done a little bit better with drugs, not perfectly, but is to not cut off what you look at once something gets on the market. So there's a lot more post-marketing surveillance with drugs than there is with devices. And right now, with devices, I mean, I actually brought this up here because I wrote down from the FDA's website about reporting, because that's one of the things that just, really shocked me. There are 3 mandatory reporters of adverse events for devices. They are the manufacturer, importers, and device users, which are specifically defined as institutions like hospitals and nursing homes, but not physicians. So there's a very limited set of who has to report. And in addition, all the mandatory reporters have to report are adverse examples of adverse events where the device either caused or contributed to death or serious injury. Not just some adverse event, but serious injury. Or it malfunctioned in such a way that death or serious injury would be expected to result, which is just way under who and what should be reported. Now, something that could be done, that is done with drugs, is to use electronic medical records to monitor even low-frequency side effects. And if we did that more, of course, there are privacy worries, but if data are group data and no identifiers, you could get patterns even with somewhat rarer side effects and not have to rely on after-the-fact tort suits and other things like that.
Tort suits are so imperfect.
And still get stuff on the market because, we do need, we don't want to be back in 1940. Exactly.
Bayer wanted to implant new women this last year to, instead of asking those of us that had it already, they were implanting new women. And actually, it didn't show this, but Bayer has actually said that they are going to remove it from the US market at the end of this year. Yay. Unfortunately, there are doctors that are going to push it, and they have until 2019, the end of 2019, to implant new women.
And you are a very sophisticated, mobilized group of consumers that it took your efforts to really challenge that. That's not It shouldn't require that. You shouldn't have to be that sophisticated. There are a lot of people who have no idea why they're
Right.
experiencing what they're experiencing, and they don't have a
I
Facebook
didn't put
group.
2 and 2 together until my sister-in-law was like, hey, you should go join this group. And then everything fell into place. And now the eSure women are advocating for the Medical Device Safety Act of 2017 that would bring the ability for us to seek legal recourse towards the companies, which, like you said, in the last 10 years has been really hard, if not
You have to show
impossible.
fraud, right? Like, it can't
Right.
just be that it's defective. You have
Right.
to show that they defect.
And so we're asking that everybody contact your congressman, senator, and ask them to please sponsor the Medical Device Safety Act of 2017 so we stop getting used as lab rats and medical safety device cash cows.
Yes. On the other hand, think about this. Has anybody heard of right to try laws and the 21st Century Cures Act? They all sound really cool, right? To a lot of people. You know, lots of states have right to there's a federal one. But that's scary too, because what those do in the name of let's give people who are really sick and don't have alternatives hope, those encourage a lot of guinea pig stuff too. So, and there were consumer groups pushing for those. So, be careful. Yeah, be careful.
Yeah, let's open it up for a question. And we're going to do this Sundance style if we can. So if you can project your question into the audience, I can repeat it. Yes, sir.
So every time a drug commercial comes on the television, there's always this disclaimer at the end, may cause diarrhea, may cause death, may cause, and I always kind of laugh and think, well, I'd never take that pill. But the thing about drugs is you can stop taking it. And after a period of time, hopefully, those side effects adverse, if you have them, go away. But this is scary because once it's in you, the process of reversing that is either not there or it's a lot more difficult. So as an average consumer, where do we go if we're all of a sudden in a situation in a month or 2 months where a doctor recommends putting a device in? I personally would want, how do we go beyond the doctor? He may have, or she may have good intentions, this is going to be great, but how do we research further and get accurate information to make a better decision?
I wish I would have Googled a lot and I would have completely avoided this. And I cannot tell you how hard it was to find a doctor that was knowledgeable about it. Luckily, my implanting doctor was the doctor that just removed mine. But I got told that if they weren't right there, that he was not going to go searching for them. So luckily, it had migrated into my uterus. And so luckily, mine were intact and was able to be taken out. But there's only 2 in the state of Utah that will remove them, no questions asked. And and just ask, no, not necessarily. If I would have Googled like eSure problems, I would have came up with that Facebook group and I could have asked peers, maybe put it out there, find the Facebook groups and different things like that. Ask your doctors, I never received my pamphlet from eSure. I had no clue that it had nickel in it. I'm allergic to nickel. I was told, and so was the doctor for that matter, that it was made from a certain, so it's a danged if you do, danged if you don't.
And if there's a device early to market, how do you research that? Is there enough ample information out there? I mean, how do you?
No,
That's a
I
crapshoot.
mean, I would say, I think Google, if it's far enough along that there are reports of risks, it could be helpful, but in some cases it might be, you might not be getting good information either. That's the FDA's job. Like that's why we have a regulatory system, is to clear that so you don't have to do the searching. I would recommend, if possible, if you can, figuring out if your physician has been compensated by the device manufacturer at all, and if they have, try to find a second opinion from someone who has not. Always, again, not nefarious. They might be getting money to actually be doing good education work, but sometimes they're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars to go on vacation, to consult or to promote the product. And so obviously they could have a conflict of interest.
The last, one of the last scenes in the movie was a list of safety tips, and those were very high on the list.
And even like $5,000 can have an impact on someone's prescribing habits, so.
Yeah. And one of the things that they said was, be alert that new is not necessarily better.
Yes, ma'am.
So how do we stop that marketing? I can remember a time period when they did not market medication on television. And now they market medication on television. People walk into their doctors and say, I have to have this pill. But we're kind of seeing the same thing, only from the doctor presenting and saying, you know, this is the newest, best medical device because it's being marketed to them that way. How do we stop that? And how do we stop that compensation? Because that's part of that marketing is what's driving this problem.
Wow, big question. You want to take, I have thoughts.
Weaponizing free speech, I don't know.
I would say reversing Citizens United would be the way. I mean, it's the money. So this is such a big issue, not just with safety, but with things like the Affordable Care Act. One of the main reasons the Affordable Care Act was challenged was because of the medical device industry and the regulations and the fines that the ACA imposed on them. Tracking the money, I think, not voting for congresspeople who take significant amounts of money from organizations the problem is everyone does. This is a bipartisan approach. If you look for even AdvaMed or pharma, they send a lot of money to both parties. And it's not all dirty money, so that's really hard to track back and say, is it a quid pro quo or a wink wink where they're saying, here's the money to pass this legislation that's not good for the public.
And with contemporary commitments to freedom of expression, that's where a lot of the advertising comes. One of the most important things to do is you fight information with information.
Other audience questions? Yes, in the middle?
Where is the American Medical Association with all this?
So I would say they have done some important things to encourage institutions to require reporting of physician reimbursement for consulting fees. And that's this first step, right? That you can at least go to a website and see who's been receiving money from which medical device company. But that also requires some work on the part of the consumer. So I think that these are all sort of imperfect ways to respond to this problem. They're not really elegant. The best way would be to prevent the injuries from happening. But it's never going to get down to zero because that rep from the industry was right, that you're always going to have some unintended consequences, and that's the nature of even good devices. But some of these things are happening because they're getting out there way too fast. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on the AMA?
Yes, in the back.
I think it would be a little interesting if these medical device companies were required to contract, say, with a third party that was like a patient care representative, that patients could call in to discuss the complications with them, or that perhaps you could sign up and have them check in with you from time to time, discuss complications, and that the company would have to pay for that, but they would not be employed directly by the company, and they would be responsible to report these things down to the FDA. I mean, clearly, when people just sort of make these individual reports to the FDA, it just sort of goes into this black hole, and nothing ever happens with it. I would like to see the companies being required to pay for a third-party patient care company.
Can I actually give personal experience? I was actually in a clinical trial for a medication for one of my e-share problems, and they actually it was a third party that was doing it. It was Physicians Research Options here in the state of Utah that was doing it for Pfizer Lilly. So they actually are doing that, but I don't know how much, like how linked they were to Pfizer Lilly, or whether they were doing it for other companies too.
The company doesn't like what they're doing, they're not going to
True.
That's a great idea. I mean, independence, make it more objective.
Yes, sir.
Why again can't the e-share group sue Bayer then?
Because they went through, I'm kind of lame at this.
No,
but
I get-
it's the they went through the pre-market approval, and then there was a lawsuit in 2008.
Yeah, there was a
was?
Supreme Court case that said, so you're familiar with federalism, right? Like the national government is supreme over the state governments for certain things. So if there's a federal law that occupies the field and regulates an area, then it gets to regulate at the exclusion of the states. So if the medical device amendments of 1976 say that if something clears through the PMA process, which each issuer did, then you can't, as an individual, sue under state law for product defect, because it's thought that that federal regulation through the FDA medical device amendments covers the field, and we don't want conflict between the states and the federal government when it comes to regulatory stuff. So you would have to show something other than a common law claim like product defect or failure to warn. You'd have to show something greater than that, like fraud. So there have been a couple of cases in Philadelphia where a judge has said, we think that the Bayer's behavior here in promoting this and in failing to disclose things to FDA went beyond common law tort claims like product defect, design defect, and failure to warn. It was actually fraudulent, and so then they could bring the claim. But unless you can show fraud, you can't bring a state court product defect claim. Same thing. So it's the same substantive law that would apply there. It would just be bringing a bunch of people together to bring the claim. But yeah. So it doesn't seem that works for that same thing applies if it goes through 510 clearance. It may not be preempted, but.
Great. Yes.
So Teneille, what happens with these fraud cases? Like, what happened with that? So
It's still going. It was the first
Set of cases where plaintiffs were actually able to get through. And so that's the other problem, is bringing a lawsuit is expensive. You have to find an attorney, you have to have the time, the energy, the emotional bandwidth, and then to be told you're barred. You can't, oh yeah, well, it looks like it's a pretty bad product. Otherwise, we would consider it defective because it's designed in a way that's way too risky and that the benefits don't outweigh the risks. But we happen to have this regulatory framework where if it's passed through FDA, you're just blocked. Even though we don't think maybe it is safe enough. So then I think a lot of plaintiffs were bringing those suits and were just being blocked left and right. And the very first group that seems to have better evidence of fraud were able to get through that. But that's like a year old, and so it's still ongoing. I'm not sure I can update you later what the status of the case is. I can check it out. That takes a lot of burden on those consumers who've already been injured to then, after the fact, it doesn't fix their injury, it just gives them money. So, right, it's a very imperfect fix.
Other question? Yes, ma'am.
So this is the first time that I've been introduced to this problem going on, and I guess it's super easy for me to feel suffocated when all of this is kind of business and money involved, and it all comes down to finances and who's making what money. And I guess I'm just curious if there's any policy being pushed now to make it so the FDA isn't pointing fingers at business, they're pointing fingers at FDA. Is there any policy being pushed currently that's trying to stop the loopholes from happening in the FDA and making it so people are upholding better ethics within whatever jobs that they're supposed to be doing that we assume is in our best favor and our offer that clearly really isn't?
I wish.
Right? Yeah, no, there's nothing going on. And in fact, FDA, in terms of regulatory agencies, has a better reputation for a bit more independence between industry and a little less industry capture. But obviously, it's still present in FDA too. It's worse in energy and other agencies. Near future, no. So wah. No, I don't think so.
Vote in November.
Yeah, that's the take-home message, right?
Is there a question? Yes.
Well, I have a couple things. I think one is it's hard because we live in a society of instant gratification. People want something now, they want to feel better now, they want a quick fix for stuff. And so I think part of that's on consumers that you have to realize any medical stuff you do is going to have complications. I mean, you're going to have complications in a medical procedure, anything you have done. So I guess I'm wondering, how are you finding balance between you don't want to completely stifle innovation and medical advances for people that make huge differences in their quality of life, but at the same time, you have to keep some of those people in check because it is about profit.
Demand better clinical trials, bigger numbers of clinical trials. Like, so you can't do a small study of 100 and think that's going to extrapolate to the whole population. I think what's done in drugs with phases of trials and going from maybe 100 to, okay, this seems safe enough, let's test it in 1,000 or maybe even 5,000, 10,000, and then requiring much more post-market surveillance that isn't voluntary, I think is the way to go. Because that does seem to, you're right, you don't want to swing too far in the other direction and remove the incentives for people to create some of these amazing devices.
It's not a one-off, it's a process.
Just, I was curious about why there weren't any medical people on the panel, because I'd be interested in, some of the medical people's perspective about that. And I say that as someone who has had botched medical care that almost killed me, but I've also had some tremendously great medical care. So I'm just wondering about that medical perspective of people that are just trying to be good doctors or trying to serve, people.
They're kind of
Hard to find.
I don't,
Unfortunately.
our production colleagues put the panels together. I'm not sure if we did reach out to medical. I think that it would have been an absolutely great perspective to have on the panel, and we can take that into consideration for sure. Oh no, I think it's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can follow up, and we can follow up with you too if you want to come talk to me after. But
I consulted with a bunch of physicians, and some who were really interested in medical device innovation and are even working on medical device innovation. And they see this problem with everything is, the fulcrum is getting the clearance through the FDA for the whole business model. All of the pressure goes on getting that FDA clearance or approval. And so you'll do what you need to do to get that, the minimum of what you need to do to get that. But once you get that, it is gangbusters with the marketing team. And so we're going to do a lot of training, but the doctors see that too. Sometimes they want more training and they would like to be trained by someone with clinical skills and not someone who's a drug rep. So I think it's not all the case that physicians are financially incentivized to do the wrong thing. I think some of them would like to get better training, but it's not there because of what you saw in the film.
Right, and they said that they've changed how you should remove Essure multiple times of how Bayer and the FDA has said that it should be removed.
yes, sir. Linda.
Yes, I noticed one of the notes in the picture said that the FDA had ruled that the benefits outweigh the risk. Was that a database ruling or just kind of an opinion?
Which device was that for?
That was
That
for
was for
Essure.
sure. The way I read that in the film, and I don't know, that was in the letter that the FDA sent to the filmmakers.
For the filmmakers.
Right.
So you could actually, if that was in a letter, you could file a Freedom of Information Act request based to get all their data that they're using to come.
I know that the women of
Essure page. I'm just a member. I'm not one of the administrators of the group. I know that they have requested and they've watched that really closely, and time again, the FDA has been late on posting that information.
You can get some data. Some data is also going to be protected as intellectual property. So.
My guess is with that letter, it was almost like a political response based on the previous clearance. I don't think they based it probably on new data. But.
no, it was 17,000 adverse
Last year alone, I think it's 27,000 since 2002. Yeah, and it's serious ones.
Well, I'd love to end on sort of the $400 billion question. If we can't change these laws, we can't convince these companies to face the more moral and ethical decisions, where do we go? How do we, on a community level, and as an individual consumer, inform ourselves? We talked about that a little bit, but from each of your perspectives, how do we get ourselves informed? And on the FDA level, there were good questions as well. What are each of your opinions on what's next?
Obviously, I'm in this situation
Yes.
because I didn't know where to go or what to do or who to find. I didn't Google it. I took somebody's word for it. My doctor was lied to. It's really hard.
It's very hard.
And I work with patients on a daily basis, so that have had hip, joint, knee, shoulders, all of that. So I'm not only upset by the Essure portion of this. I was appalled.
Yeah, of across the gamut. of
across
all
the
of
gamut for all of that. So, because I worked in healthcare for 10 years and was appalled.
More information, reporting, and one other economically motivated actor that nobody's mentioned. I'll bet insurance paid for most of those implants. And getting insurers to demand more in the way of quality information because it costs money.
I don't think I have a lot more to say.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all so much, and please share this film with your families and your communities. It's on Netflix. Getting this out, and I think to the masses is important as well. So thank you again to our panel. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.